I'm seeking advice on how to rescue my marriage. To provide some context, I've been married to my husband for 5 years, and we've been together for a total of 7 years. For privacy reasons, I'll refer to us as Jeff and Justine. We first crossed paths during our second year at community college. I earned a 2-year degree in office management, while Jeff pursued a 4-year degree in business administration from a university that offers remote classes at our community college. I'm currently 26 years old, and Jeff is 27, and we had plans to start a family later this year. Our dream was to have 4 children, preferably 2 boys and 2 girls. Our marriage was very happy, and both our families had a deep affection for both of us. However, this is where I made a significant mistake. I developed a close relationship with someone some might refer to as a work husband. In my case, it was a delivery driver for one of the major delivery companies that serviced our office. To protect his privacy, let's call him Byron. Byron is 25 years old and single, and he had been making deliveries to my office for nearly 2 years. From the moment we first met, there was a connection, not a romantic one, but an undeniable chemistry. It's challenging to put into words. I was drawn to him, and we would often chat for at least 10 minutes every time he came by. I eagerly anticipated his visits and made sure to be at the front when it was time for his delivery. One day, our conversation took an unusual turn. Byron mentioned that he had a personal question to ask me, emphasizing its sensitive nature and his desire not to harm our working relationship or cause any offense. I assured him that he could ask me anything without hesitation. He then confided, "I feel a very strong attraction to you and wondered if you felt the same way." I was surprised by his boldness, and I felt embarrassed. I told him, "Give me a moment to collect myself," and then admitted, "Yes, I definitely feel the same way." Byron responded, "If you weren't married, I would have asked you out a long time ago." I thanked him for the compliment, and he left, and that was the end of it. Over the next week, our interactions were brief and somewhat uncomfortable whenever he made his package deliveries. I worried and felt guilty, thinking I might have crossed a line with him. Back at home, Jeff and I were happily enjoying our married life. I want to be clear that I was entirely content with Jeff as my lover, friend, and husband. At the time, I believed he felt the same about me. However, I made the mistake of entertaining thoughts about having both my loving husband and some kind of relationship with Byron beyond our work conversations. I later found out that this is sometimes referred to as being a cake eater. I began researching the topic and came across articles on polyamory and open marriages. Initially, I found these ideas ridiculous and distasteful, so I didn't explore them further at that time. I also knew that my husband would not be open to such an arrangement, and even if he were, it would strain our marriage and lead to disapproval from both of our families, something I wanted to avoid. Weeks passed, and my married life continued to be as wonderful as ever, but I couldn't stop pondering the idea of connecting with Byron. I started delving back into the subject and stumbled upon a blog post titled, "It Doesn't Hurt to Ask." The post was written by a woman who claimed to be in a successful open marriage. In her blog, she shared her experience of having a great marriage, but wanting to explore a relationship with a man she did volunteer work with. The blogger discussed her struggle in approaching this topic with her husband without jeopardizing their marriage. She admitted to keeping these feelings bottled up for over 2 years. Then, one day during a long drive, she gathered the courage to bring it up to her surprise. Her husband was quite receptive. To cut a long story short, they decided to open their marriage, and now both have partners outside their marriage, seeing them 3 to 4 times per month. According to the blogger, they've been doing this for 4 years, and their marriage is stronger than ever, and they're both happier than before. I found her story fascinating because it aligned with my desires, but I was too apprehensive to discuss it with my husband. Then one Sunday morning, while we were casually browsing the web on our phones and chatting at home, I mustered the courage to bring it up. I asked him, "I recently read an online post about open marriages. What's your take on them?" He replied, "You mean where couples are involved with other people?" I confirmed, saying, "Yes, exactly. What are your thoughts on it?" He expressed his disapproval, finding it distasteful, and believed people should simply get divorced if they wanted to have relationships outside of marriage. I mentioned that this concept was gaining popularity in the US and many Western countries. Jeff's facial expression clearly showed his disgust with the topic, so I promptly changed the subject. I decided not to bring it up again, as I didn't want to risk harming our strong marriage based on his reaction. A few weeks passed, and Jeff and I were enjoying an affectionate moment in bed, filled with love after an intimate encounter. I was resting on his chest, unable to see his face when, out of the blue, he asked, "Who were you thinking of when you brought up open marriages last week?" His question caught me off guard, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I slowly lifted my head to look at him and replied, "What are you talking about? What do you mean?" Jeff explained that he had done some research suggesting that if a woman brings up the idea of an open relationship with her partner, it typically means she has either already cheated or is keeping someone as an option. I was once again taken aback, or more accurately, I was deeply unsettled, and Jeff could see it. He said, "I know you too well. I can sense you're keeping something from me, so be honest." I fell silent, averted my gaze, and then admitted that I had not been unfaithful and had no intention of being so. However, I confessed that if we ever considered an open marriage, there was a work colleague I might consider. Jeff then asked me to tell him about this work friend. I proceeded to describe Byron and our relationship up to that point, including what Byron had shared about his feelings. However, I didn't reveal that I had reciprocated those feelings. Then, Jeff said something that deeply unsettled me. He remarked, "You know, technically you've already betrayed me." I firmly refuted his claim, insisting that I hadn't. He responded, "Well, the relationship you have with this guy, Byron, is approaching what's known as an emotional affair." I was unfamiliar with this term, so Jeff proceeded to explain it to me. Growing increasingly frustrated, Jeff suggested we drop the conversation as he needed rest for an early start the next day. He soon fell asleep, but I found myself unable to rest. Instead, I reached for my phone and searched for information on emotional affairs, reading various articles and posts about the topic. To my dismay, Jeff was right. What I had with Byron closely resembled an emotional affair. In fact, let me rephrase that. It was an emotional affair. I felt overwhelmed by guilt, as though I had betrayed my husband. My inability to sleep led me downstairs, where I prepared some tea. I ended up dozing off on the couch around 4 a.m. At approximately 6:45 a.m., Jeff woke me up with a kiss, informing me that he was heading to work and that it was nearly 7 a.m., urging me to start my day. I returned his kiss and told him I loved him, as I always did. This time, I emphasized the gesture even more, but my mind was plagued by guilt over my attraction to Byron. Several more days passed, and once again we were lying in bed after an intimate moment. Out of nowhere, Jeff mentioned that he'd be open to trying an open marriage if it was genuinely what I desired. This caught me off guard, and I asked, "Why are you bringing this up now?" He explained that he had been contemplating it, considering our previous discussions, and believed that if it was something we wanted to explore, we should do it while we're still young. I expressed my interest but made it clear that I would never do anything to jeopardize our marriage because Jeff was the most important person in my life. Jeff responded by saying, "If our love bond is strong, it will withstand infidelity." I pointed out that a mutual open relationship isn't considered infidelity since both partners agree to it. However, he didn't acknowledge that and simply said, "Consider our marriage to be open starting right now." This took me by surprise, and I urged him to slow down, emphasizing the need to establish ground rules. He mentioned 3 ground rules. 1. We needed to communicate in advance when and with whom we were going to be involved. 2. After any encounters, we had to share the fact with each other without going into explicit details. And 3. We must use protection for all intimate activities, without exceptions. I agreed to these stipulations and suggested a couple more. 4. That we keep our open marriage confidential, and 5. That we promise our extramarital relationships would not harm our marriage, and we would remain committed to each other. However, Jeff couldn't agree to these additional points. When I asked why, he simply stated that he couldn't and didn't want to discuss it. I felt uneasy about this situation because it was unlike Jeff's usual character. Despite my concerns, I cuddled up to him, and we fell asleep. My conversations with Jeff left me unsettled about the idea of an open relationship, as if he had some hidden agenda. So for the following month, I didn't pursue the open relationship, and we continued to live our lives as usual. During this time, I distanced myself from Byron at work, engaging only in brief, superficial discussions about topics like the weather and our busy schedules. Then, one day, Byron expressed that he missed our conversations and asked what was bothering me. I explained that I had been busy both at the office and at home, which left me with little time for our chats. Internally, I debated whether to disclose my open marriage to him. Ultimately, I decided to do so, but I deeply regret it now. Recognizing that the office wasn't the appropriate place for such a conversation, I proposed meeting for a drink after work. He agreed, and we arranged to meet at a local bar with outdoor seating due to the pleasant early spring weather. During our meeting, I revealed my recently open marriage and directly asked him if he would be interested in a relationship with me. Without hesitation, he said yes, and mentioned that he had been eagerly awaiting my decision, respecting my space without pushing. He admitted to having dreams about me for months. Much of our conversation during the meeting revolved around sexual topics. It was a Tuesday, and we decided to meet the following day at his apartment right after work. I emphasized that I needed to leave by 6:30 p.m. to prioritize my husband. That evening, I prepared a lovely dinner for Jeff, and afterward, I disclosed my conversation and upcoming meeting with Byron. I explained that we had set a date for the next day and asked if he was still on board with our open marriage. Jeff seemed taken aback and asked, "So you're going to meet him tomorrow?" I confirmed this, but reassured him that we could still reconsider because he and our relationship were my primary focus. Jeff agreed to proceed, albeit with a somewhat distant and stiff hug, unlike our usual embrace. I attributed this to nervousness. We didn't engage in much conversation that night as Jeff was working in his office, and I had office work to attend to as well. We went to bed, and I cuddled with him, attempting to initiate intimacy. But he declined, citing fatigue and the need for sleep. When I woke up the next morning, Jeff had already left and sent me a text explaining he had an early meeting and forgot to inform me about it. He assured me he'd see me later that night. This behavior was unlike him, but I brushed it off, got dressed, and headed to work. I dressed in a cute outfit that day, knowing that Byron and I would be meeting after work. Throughout the day, I texted Jeff, but he didn't respond. I contemplated canceling my date with Byron, a decision I now deeply regret. However, at 4:17 p.m., I received a text from Jeff expressing his love and confirming our plans for the evening. I felt relieved and took this as a signal from him to proceed. Byron and I met, and the physical encounter was satisfying, though not quite reaching the level of satisfaction I experienced with Jeff. There were no feelings of love, but the sheer lust and the taboo nature of our actions made it very fulfilling. I left his place after about an hour and a half and arrived home just after 6:40 p.m. To my surprise, Jeff was not home yet. I was okay with this as it gave me time to shower and wash my clothes to remove the scent of Byron's cologne. I didn't want Jeff to detect it. Despite feeling physically fulfilled, I was overwhelmed by guilt, shame, and remorse, and I just felt dirty. I had a genuine inner conflict and was nervous. I decided to prepare a quick but special dinner for Jeff, lighting candles to set the mood. I wanted to ensure that he understood how much I loved him and that the physical encounter with Byron meant absolutely nothing to me. It was purely physical, and nowhere near the level of love and physical satisfaction I share with him. Don't be deceived by this. I was hoping that our night would conclude with us making love. That's just unpleasant. I understand that some of you might view this as selfish and outright distasteful, but please keep in mind that I used protection for everything I did with Byron, and there was no exchange of bodily fluids of any kind. At 7:30 p.m., Jeff still hadn't returned home, so I attempted to call him, but it went straight to voicemail, so I sent him a text stating that I was home and had dinner waiting. I received no response. It was now 8:50 p.m., and I was growing worried. I continued calling him, leaving messages and sending texts. Around 9:30 p.m., I received a text from him, saying not to wait up as he would be home late. I replied, asking where he was and who he was with, but he didn't respond. Exhausted, I fell asleep sometime after midnight. I was awakened by the sound of the shower running in the spare bathroom, so I went to investigate. The door was locked, which was unusual for Jeff, so I knocked, but he didn't answer. Then, about 10 minutes later, Jeff emerged with a towel wrapped around him and casually asked, "Hey, how was your night?" I replied, "It was okay." He then asked, "Did you sleep with Byron?" I requested that he not use that word, but then admitted that yes, we had been together. I inquired about his whereabouts, and he explained that he had spent the night out at several bars and had been dancing. When I mentioned the scent of perfume on his discarded clothes, he responded, "That's not important because I didn't sleep with her." I asked, "Who is this her?" He argued that since they hadn't been intimate, he didn't need to disclose her identity to me. Jeff had never used such explicit language with me, which raised serious concerns. I then questioned why he had used the guest bathroom for his shower, and he replied that he would be using the guest bedroom and bathroom until I had taken 2 STD tests. This devastated me, and I exclaimed, "What? This wasn't part of our agreement. I ensured that Byron used protection for everything we did." He responded, "Have you never heard of oral HIV or oral herpes? I'm not getting within 6 feet of you until you get the all clear. Consider it my version of social distancing." I was deeply upset, tears streaming down my face, and I told Jeff that I wanted to close the marriage, as this was the last thing I wanted to happen. Jeff firmly stated, "No way! You got what you wanted, and I'm going to get mine." Amid my tears, he mentioned that he was heading to bed, emphasizing an early meeting and the need for rest. I remained awake most of the night, crying my heart out, and eventually drifted off to sleep on the couch. When I woke up, Jeff had once again left quietly, sending me a text that said, "Don't wait up for me." I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I sent texts and left messages throughout the day, but received no response. I felt sick and like I was losing my mind, believing that I had likely ruined my marriage. We didn't have any deliveries that day, so I didn't see Byron. However, I called him at 4:30 p.m. and asked if we could meet that night. He agreed, noting that I sounded upset. I told him I was, and that we would discuss it when I arrived at his place. During our meeting, I expressed my desire to end our relationship, acknowledging that it had been a significant mistake because I loved my husband and wanted only him. I explained the situation to Byron, and he understood. He requested one final encounter and assured me that he would have no further personal interaction with me, limiting our interactions to work purposes. I agreed, and we had a brief encounter, just plain missionary, lasting less than 10 minutes. Afterward, he commented, "That was terrible. You just lay there like a tree trunk." I apologized and admitted that this whole situation was a huge mistake and not his fault. I got dressed, gave him one final hug, and left. Before I left, Byron remarked, "I'll never understand women like you." I asked for clarification, and he simply replied, "Nothing, no comment," with a look of complete disgust on his face. I quickly departed, tears streaming down my face during the entire drive home. How could I have been so foolish? I had destroyed my marriage, and for what? For absolutely nothing. I felt like the most foolish person on the planet and once again just felt dirty. Jeff didn't return home until 1 a.m. that night. I felt sick, knowing that I had single-handedly ruined my life. On Friday, Jeff did the same thing, leaving before I woke up and texting me not to wait up for him. This emotional distance and coldness were devastating to my soul. I loved spending time with my husband in the mornings, evenings, and weekends, preparing his meals, cuddling, going for walks after dinner, and simply chatting about trivial matters. All of that had disappeared, and I missed it terribly. I texted Jeff, expressing my desire to talk with him first thing tomorrow morning, and he agreed, mentioning that he was leaving for the day afterward. I asked where he was going, but he didn't respond. He didn't return home until 1:30 a.m. I remained silent, lying in bed and crying. Once again, he took a shower and went straight to bed. I woke up early, waiting for Jeff to get up. He entered the kitchen at 7 a.m. and poured himself some orange juice. The atmosphere was cold and devoid of emotion. He avoided eye contact, sat down at the table, and started focusing on his phone. I got up, went over to him, and sat on his lap, urging him to look at me. He initially averted his gaze, but I gently held his face, looking into his brown eyes. I expressed my deep love for him and acknowledged that I had made a terrible decision, not just a simple mistake. I apologized sincerely and promised to do anything to regain his trust and love. He remained silent, staring at me as though I were crazy. I asked if he loved me and he gave no response. I implored him, saying, "Jeff, please, answer me." He admitted that he didn't know. I couldn't hold back the tears and said, "I can make things right." He replied, "I don't think you can." In my frustration, I called him a bastard and accused him of planning all this, suggesting he set me up for divorce. He denied this, but admitted that when I introduced the idea of an open marriage, he sensed our relationship was likely doomed based on what he had read. I questioned why he hadn't just put his foot down and insisted that I end all contact with Byron. He replied, "You can't force someone to be faithful. You're either faithful or not, and you clearly are not a monogamous person." I cried and pleaded with him, insisting that I was monogamous and begging him not to give up on us. He left without saying anything, mentioning that he'd return after midnight. I reminded him that tomorrow was Easter Sunday, and we had plans to leave at 7 a.m. to drive to my parents' house. My family adored him, and we typically spent almost every holiday with them, especially since his parents now lived in Florida. He informed me that he wouldn't be joining me. I was taken aback and crushed, pleading with him to come along, but he simply responded coldly with a no. Worried about what I would tell my parents, I asked him, and he callously replied that he didn't care, suggesting I should just tell them the truth. Despite my begging and pleading for him to stay home with me, he got dressed, grabbed a gym bag of clothes, and left the house. I'm emotionally shattered and feel utterly defeated. I'm reaching out to the community here for any advice and steps I can take to salvage my marriage. I'm particularly interested in hearing from people who have faced similar challenges with open marriages, and whether it's possible for a couple to recover from such a breach of trust. I'd greatly appreciate insights from those who have successfully reconciled after being in an open relationship. Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I'm going back to bed now, where I'll spend the day in tears. Update. I wanted to provide everyone with an update. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude to those who offered feedback and support. Your words have been a source of comfort during these past few days. I'm aware that many people rightfully criticized me and used harsh language, and I acknowledge that I deserve it. I value your input as well. Easter Sunday and today have been incredibly challenging for me, among the most difficult days of my life. I drove to my parents' home, and upon arriving, their first question was about Jeff's whereabouts. To avoid causing any disturbance during our family gathering, I fabricated a story, telling them that he had a work emergency and couldn't make it. I chose this path to spare everyone's feelings. Initially, my family bought my explanation, but as the day progressed, their suspicions grew, mainly because I wasn't communicating with my husband as I typically would. To divert their concerns, I sent several fake texts, pretending to receive replies from him. I informed them that he was still occupied at the office and would contact me the following day. The reality, however, is that he didn't call or message me at all, not even to check on my well-being. This was incredibly disheartening. I had planned to spend the night at my parents' house and disclose our marital issues on Monday. I dreaded this conversation because I knew they would express their disapproval and disappointment. As expected, when I told them this morning, it unfolded just as I had anticipated. They raised their voices, used hurtful language, claimed they hadn't raised me to behave this way, and made various other harsh comments. They even contacted my sister, who joined in reprimanding me. I cried and expressed my apologies to them. I acknowledged the terrible mistake I've made and assured them that I've learned from it and won't repeat it in the future. I emphasized that my primary focus now is to regain Jeff's love and trust. In the end, even though they were quite upset with me, they conveyed their love and mentioned that they would pray for the possibility of saving our marriage. On Monday evening, I returned home. Throughout the day, I made attempts to call and message Jeff, but received no response. Upon arriving home, I discovered a note on the kitchen counter stating that he had gone to Florida to visit his parents and would be back on Sunday. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, knowing that our plans to visit his parents in early May were now jeopardized because of my actions. I can't help but despise myself. That's all I can say for now. I'm just overwhelmed with depression and sadness. What worries me the most is that I've stopped crying. The pain and remorse I carry within me now run so deep that tears no longer offer any relief. 1-year update. Now I have both bad news and good news to share. First, the bad news. I am divorced. The divorce was finalized back in December. In the end, Jeff decided that he couldn't continue the marriage after my involvement with another man. He expressed that he could never trust me again and felt uncomfortable being seen in public with me. He believed that getting a divorce restored his sense of masculinity. I disagree with this perspective because I believe he never lost his masculinity. It's worth noting that only our families know about my brief connection with Byron. No one else is aware of it. Now for the good news, or rather, the great news. Jeff and I started dating again last month. We rekindled our relationship on Valentine's Day, and it has been amazing. We see each other only when he wants, which amounts to about once a week. Interestingly, our passion and chemistry are even stronger than when we first got together 7 years ago. Jeff has made it explicitly clear that our relationship is purely physical, and we will never be married, live together, or be a couple again. That's the latest update from me, and I might not post again unless there's a significant development. However, I would truly appreciate your thoughts on my situation. Do you think I'm making a mistake by dating Jeff again? Should I consider moving on to find a new love and start a family with someone else instead? Just to clarify, Byron is not in the picture and never was. He was a regrettable decision I won't repeat. Thanks, and I hope you have a fantastic St. Patrick's Day. All right, that was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned and let's dive in. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and I found myself in a situation that's a bit embarrassing to explain. My husband, who is 28, and I've been together for over 5 years, including our 4 years of dating before marriage. We both come from the same small town and were part of the same social circle. About 2 years ago, we moved to the city because my husband had to relocate for work. But we still visited our hometown occasionally. During last Christmas, we returned to our hometown to celebrate with our families. It was then that I discovered some of my husband's old friends were also in town, and he had invited them over for dinner. I was more than happy to host them. However, it was when I met my husband's childhood friend, who had a charming, boyish smile that captivated me, that I began to feel a longing for something more in life. On Christmas Eve, we couldn't help but exchange meaningful glances. I noticed how he would discreetly check me out whenever I stood up, and it oddly boosted my ego. Nothing more happened that night. However, since Christmas, we've been chatting almost daily. Our conversations gradually became more flirtatious, and I found myself yearning for a physical relationship. We had planned to stay in our hometown until New Year's, so we threw a big New Year's party, and he was there. It was a couple of hours into the night, after everyone had gone to sleep and my husband had passed out on the couch, when I struck up a conversation with his friend. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we were in the attic, which used to be my old bedroom, succumbing to our physical desires. A sense of clarity washed over me after that moment of intimacy. I realized what I had done, and I couldn't stop crying. I thought it might have been better to confess to my husband. When we returned to the city, that's precisely what I did. The aftermath was devastating. My husband's reaction was explosive, and he stormed out of the house, not returning for 2 days. When he finally came back, I learned that he had confronted his friend and even resorted to violence, making him promise to stay away from me. After he had calmed down, he expressed his willingness to work on our relationship, which brought me a sense of relief. We attended therapy for 2 months after the incident, putting in a lot of effort to give our relationship another chance. However, I had taken my husband's easygoing nature for granted. 2 months later, one night while my husband was on a night shift, I received a flirty message from his friend. I couldn't resist and found myself in a full-fledged sexual chat. This time, though, I made the decision that if my husband didn't know, it couldn't hurt him. So I kept it a secret and enjoyed both my husband's affection and the intimacy with his friend. However, life had different plans for me. My husband discovered my affair less than a week after it began, and he was furious, to the point where I was afraid to talk to him. After a confrontation, he demanded that I pack my bags and leave immediately, leaving me no choice. I returned to our hometown and stayed at a motel for a couple of days, hoping he would reach out and ask me to come back home. I acknowledge the pain I've caused, but I'm struggling to come to terms with the extreme step he took by kicking me out of our home. I then moved into my grandparents' house and couldn't find the words to explain what had led to the end of our long-term relationship. My doubts about the respect in our relationship and how it might impact our healing process have left me in a state of mental chaos. I not only feel disappointed in myself for my actions, but also don't know how to reconcile with it all. If anyone has advice for someone in my situation, I would greatly appreciate it. Edit. I had hoped something would change. We did exchange numbers, though. I had persuaded my husband to meet his friends